Welcome, dear listener. You found the Sleepless Lantern. Tonight, our light drifts toward the gentle warmth of a village kitchen, far from the pages of kings and battles. Here, a clay pot waits by the fire, humble, cracked, and listening. It has simmered broths and stews, cradled in the same hearth for years, perhaps longer. Its surface holds the scent of time, of onions, of stories whispered by firelight. This is not the tale of a hero, but of memory. The kind that lingers in a kitchen, passed through hands, warm with care. Though close your eyes and settle into stillness. Let the night gather gently around you, and walk with me now into a quieter kind of path. Chapter 1. The First Soup. Leek and Silence. The pot remembers the first cold morning of the season, not by the date, but by the breath that curled from mouths, like ghosts, and the way the frost crept along the sill like a quiet thief. It remembers the way the air inside the cottage changed, sharper, quieter, edged with the stillness that only winter can bring. The fire had been banked low through the night, and the embers glowed faintly under their blanket of ash. In the dim light, the mother rose. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her bones moved with the memory of mornings like this. The hearth, the pot, the water, the leeks. She moved through the cottage with care. One child still slept, curled, under a rough wool blanket, stuffed with straw. The other stirred faintly, but did not wake. The father had already gone, off before dawn, to mend the broken fence beyond the orchard, or perhaps barter eggs with the miller's wife. These were not days for lingering. The mother knelt by the hearth and stirred the ashes. She added a log, small and dry, and blew softly until the flames caught with a whisper. Then she stood and took the pot from its resting hook. It was blackened with age, sturdy, and slightly dented at the rim. But the bottom was smooth from years of wooden spoons, circling it, slow and sure. She carried it to the well just outside the cottage. The world was blue and still. Crows called from bare trees. The earth had crusted overnight, and her feet cracked the frozen ground. She lowered the bucket and brought up the water, cold, clear, and full of life. Back in the kitchen, she poured it in. The pot hissed faintly in greeting. The leeks were waiting. 3 of them, pulled the day before from the patch beside the house. Pale stalks wrapped in muddy roots. She cleaned them with practiced hands, slicing off the roots, peeling the outer layers, cutting carefully into coins. The smell was gentle and green, the kind of scent that does not demand attention, but waits for you to notice. She dropped them into the pot, each piece falling with a soft splash. Then a pinch of salt, precious but allowed. A handful of barley, enough to give the broth weight. A bay leaf, dried and curled like an old hand. She stirred it once, twice, then let it be. The pot began to breathe. The children woke to the smell. Not strong, but steady. It filled the corners of the room and wrapped itself around their still sleepy limbs. The older one sat up, hair wild, eyes squinting toward the hearth. The younger, still small enough to be carried, crawled from the blanket and padded barefoot across the floor. They did not ask what was for breakfast. They never did. They knew before they opened their eyes. It would be soup, and it would be warm. The mother ladled broth into 3 wooden bowls. The leeks floated gently, the barley swollen with water. It was not much, but it was enough. The children sat on low stools beside the fire. One cradled the bowl carefully with both hands. The other blew across the surface with exaggerated puffs. They ate slowly, wordlessly. Outside, the frost began to melt on the windowsill. A single bird landed on the edge of the roof and tapped its beak against the thatch. The pot, now half empty, settled back against the heat. It would not be cleaned until later. There were chores to do, spinning, mending, feeding the hens. But for a little while, the kitchen held only the quiet scrape of spoons and the warmth of something shared. Later that day, the pot would be used again, for steeping nettle leaves or boiling the last few potatoes. But it would remember this morning. The leaks, the silence, the way the soup had been eaten slowly, not because of ritual, but because there was no reason to rush. That night, as the fire was banked again and the shadows deepened in the corners of the cottage, the pot remained in place above the hearth. A little water was added to soak the crusted barley, and the lid was placed gently on top. It was not scrubbed. It was never truly clean. It carried the memory of every meal, not as taste, but as warmth. The cottage quieted. The children slept. The wind moved softly around the doorframe, but did not enter, and the pot, full from the morning, remembered. It remembered not just the ingredients, but the stillness, the unspoken rhythm of the day, the way hunger softened into comfort, and comfort into peace. It remembered the way the mother had stood for a moment after the children had finished, staring into the pot as if it might speak. She had not smiled, but she had breathed deeply. That was enough. Outside the village, beyond the narrow track that led into the woods, others stirred their own pots. In each one, leeks, salt, perhaps a turnip or an onion grown stubborn through frost. No two soups were quite the same, but they shared the same quiet purpose: to fill, to warm, to carry the day forward. This was not a feast. This was not a festival. This was simply life, and in that simplicity, a kind of quiet dignity. Chapter 2. A Winter Without Meat. Parsnip and patient. The pot remembers the quiet ache of a meatless winter, not as hunger, but as the sound of hope stretching thin. It was a year of failed hunts and empty traps, when even the forest seemed to hold its breath and hide what little it had. The rabbits had vanished early. The deer skirted far from footpaths, and no pig had been slaughtered in the hamlet that year. The salted fish had spoiled in the barrel, too damp, too warm. An omen, they said, or perhaps just misfortune. But the parsnips grew. They twisted out of the frost-hard soil with pale skins and stubborn sweetness. Though wrinkled and forked, they held firm. The pot remembers their weight in the mother's hands, lighter than meat, but still enough. Enough for broth, enough for warmth, enough to keep a child upright in the morning. That morning began with a hush that even the wind dared not break. Snow had fallen in the night, not heavily, but with purpose, laying its white hush across every path and roof. Smoke from the chimney rose straight into the sky, untroubled by wind. Inside, the hearth coals flickered lazily, almost sleepy, as if they too had braced for a long, hungry day. The mother peeled the parsnips in silence. Her fingernails were cracked from cold water and hard work, her knuckles red from wind. She did not complain. She had no one to complain to. The children were still asleep, and her husband had gone to check the traps again, though neither expected him to return with more than snow in his boots. Into the pot she dropped a scrap of suet, left from autumn barely enough to slick the bottom. It sizzled faintly, releasing a hint of meat long past. Then came the onions, too, both soft and beginning to sprout. She chopped away the green, revealing their weary cores, and added them to the pot with the patience of someone who'd done this more times than she could count. Then the parsnips. She chopped them thick, so they would hold their shape through long boiling. Their scent was earthy, almost peppery, with a hint of the sweetness that came from growing cold and slow. In they went, with a generous ladle of water and the last spoonful of barley. A sprig of thyme, dried and forgotten on a hook, was added like a promise. The fire caught slowly, licking up the sides of the pot, as if it too needed something to do. By the time the children woke, the smell had changed the air. It wasn't hearty, not like stew, but it was comforting, sweet and sharp, familiar. The boy sat up first, rubbing his eyes. The girl followed, hair tangled from restless dreams. They padded to the hearth without a word. "Is there meat?" the girl whispered. The mother shook her head. "Is it enough?" the boy asked. The mother nodded. 3 bowls were filled, one after the other. The broth was thin, but it carried the golden hue of patience and effort. Floating in it, the pale moons of parsnip slices, soft enough to break with the side of a spoon. The thyme had uncurled in the heat and lent its fragrance like a blessing. They ate slowly, not because they were full, but because there was little to follow. Later that day the snow thickened. The father returned with nothing. His eyes met the mother's for a moment, and that was all. No blame, no comfort, just recognition. But the pot still hung warm. The parsnip soup, though gone, had left its trace. She scraped the last of it into a small wooden cup, covered it with a cloth, and set it aside. That night, a neighbor knocked. Widow Ambrin, whose hands shook now when she held a needle. She had lost her husband years ago, her eldest son the year before. Her chickens had been taken by foxes, and her roof leaked when the snow melted. The mother said nothing. She simply lifted the cloth from the wooden cup and handed it over. "It's not much," she said. "It's enough," Ambrin replied. The pot remembered that too. In the days that followed, the soup was made again and again. Always parsnips, sometimes with garlic if a bulb could be spared. Once with a single carrot found curled like a question mark beneath the snow. Once with dried nettle, chopped fine de decoy. But always the parsnips, white and brave. The pot knew their shape by heart. It knew the slowness of boiling on a quiet fire, the way the children would watch it, hoping for more, the way the mother stirred not just to mix, but to soothe. This was not a winter of starvation, but it was close enough for the pot to remember it not in desperation, but in discipline, in the quiet choices that sustained them. The pot did not grieve the lack of meat. It did not mourn what never came. It remembered instead the resolve, the care, the way that parsnip soup, humble and sweet, stood between the family and despair like a sentinel. When spring finally arrived and the ground softened, and the traps began to offer again, the pot welcomed rabbit and pigeon and the wild garlic that came in green floods. But in its bones, it still held that parsnip winter, the long season of patience. And even when fuller broths were made, with bones and herbs in plenty, the pot sometimes missed the silence. The way the soup had asked so little and given so much. It would remember that winter. It always would. Chapter 3. The Healer's Broth. Garlic and old magic. In the village's far corner, near the slope where yarrow and nettle grew wild, lived a woman many whispered about, but few truly knew. They called her Mistress Leaf, though none remembered if that had ever been her real name. Children sometimes ran past her cottage with wild stories of potions and curses, but their mothers still knocked on her door, come winter, when coughs grew deep and fevers clung like shadows. The healer never minded the talk. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, her words were slow and heavy as dried herbs in a mortar. Her hands were wrinkled but precise, like they remembered every root they'd ever touched. And above her fire, always, hung the old black pot. It did not shine. It did not sparkle, but it held memories in its soot-stained belly. And the healer knew how to stir them loose. The morning had broken with frost clinging to every edge of the herb garden outside. It was a bitter day, the kind that made the smoke from her chimney curl low and reluctant. But inside, the cottage was warm, scented with thyme, and carrying the soft clink of dried garlic bulbs. Being unstrung one by one, Mistress Leaf was preparing what she called a breathing broth, not because it was magical, but because it helped people breathe again, especially the old, especially the small. She hummed under her breath as she peeled each garlic clove with care. Her song was wordless, carried not in melody but in rhythm, a soft companion to the cracking of skins and the creak of the chair beneath her. On the table were other things. Chopped leek, a scrap of turnip, a wilted carrot, and a dried piece of root that smelled sharp and strange. She added everything gently to the pot, one by one, as though she were tucking them into bed. The garlic came last, crushed, not sliced. She pressed it with the flat of her knife and let its scent fill the air, rich, pungent, ancient. She paused after that, closed her eyes, listened. Sometimes, she said, the pot would tell her when it had enough. A knock came at the door. She didn't startle, only opened one eye, as if to ask whether the knock was urgent or merely cold. Another knock. Then a soft voice. "Mistress Leaf?" The healer stood slowly. Her bones ached, but not unkindly. Pain, she always said, was just memory finding its way home. She opened the door to find a girl, no older than 10, clutching a cloth-wrapped bundle. Her nose was red, her eyes watery, and behind her stood a boy. Older, maybe 12, with a deep, rattling cough that made him shake. "Our brother," the girl said quietly. "He can't sleep. Mama says, please." Mistress Leaf nodded once, said nothing, but she reached back for a small wooden cup and dipped it into the pot. The broth wasn't done yet, but it had begun to bloom. The garlic was opening, and with it, something else, something that warmed the lungs before it even touched the lips. She handed the cup to the girl. "For him," she said, "and more when it's ready." The children hesitated. The boy looked uncertain. Then she smiled, just a little, and they took it like it was a blessing. That evening the broth deepened. Its color darkened slightly from pale to gold. The room filled with that unmistakable scent, garlic in slow bloom wrapped in herbs and steam. And in the center of it all, the pot, remembering every other time it had cooked for fever, for breath, for survival. Mistress Leaf stirred slowly, clockwise. Always clockwise. Not for magic, she said, but because her grandmother had said so. And some traditions should not be unlearned. She whispered to it as she stirred. Not spells, not charms. Just names. Names of the people she had fed. Names of those who had gotten well. Names of those who hadn't. The broth held them all. When the knock returned, latter, softer, she was already pouring the soup into a clay jar, wrapped in a wool cloth. The same children stood at the door, their faces flushed not with fever, but with the warmth of the hearth's promise. "Mama says thank you," said the girl. The boy only nodded, but his eyes, once heavy, now held something clearer. Mistress Leaf handed over the jar, along with a small sachet of dried leaf. "Steep this in hot water," she told the girl, "just before sleep. It'll keep his breath steady." The girl looked at her with something like awe. Not fear, not rumor, just trust. When they were gone, the healer sat again by the hearth, her body tired, her breath slow. She picked up a thin scrap of cloth and wiped the rim of the pot, not to clean it, but to thank it. And in the silence that followed, the pot gave back warmth, not just from the fire, but from the hundreds of soups it had ever held. Parsley from a spring that saved a coughing infant. Bay leaf from the time a neighbor walked 5 miles for help. Wild garlic for a mother who had whispered lullabies beside the flames while her child slept in her lap. None of these stories had ever been written, but the pot remembered them, and so did she. That night, the wind howled against the shutters, and the moon slid behind clouds like a coin beneath a cloth. But inside, the warmth did not falter. The pot simmered low, a steady breath against the night. Garlic still blooming, still holding, and the healer slept, her hand resting not far from its iron curve, as if to say, "I'm here," as if to whisper, "Keep going," as if to remember, this too is part of the cure. Chapter 4. Lentil for the Lost. The fire had been coaxed back to life with trembling hands. The smoke rose slowly in the dark room, curling like the memory of a song, like the hush of a chant in a stone chapel long abandoned. The pot had seen this kind of day before. It knew the sound of grief in the way wood cracked as it burned. It knew that lentils were not only for hunger, but for comfort, for quiet kitchens where voices had stopped and the world outside had grown too wide to bear. And so the pot, old and blackened, waited to be filled again. The woman who stirred it now was neither old nor young. Her hair, once braided with pride, now hung loose beneath her woolen shawl. Her apron bore the marks of many meals, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbows in the way of those who keep moving when their heart begs them to stop. Today it was just her. She had lived in this cottage with two others, her sister and her sister's child, but a sickness had come through the village in the months before, slow and strange. Not a fever that raged, but a gray fog that settled into the lungs, and then into the bone. Her sister had gone first, quietly. The child had followed 2 weeks later, no matter how tightly the woman had held him, or how many warm cloths she'd pressed to his chest. Now, all that remained was the pot, the hearth, the memories, and the lentils. She poured them in from a worn sack, brown, speckled, oddly shaped. They clinked softly into the pot like tiny stones, each one a breath, a moment, a prayer. She added water from a clay jug and a pinch of salt from a damp pouch tucked into the wall's shadow. Then came the onion, soft with time, and garlic, bruised and broken, mashed with the side of her knife. There was no meat, not today, but there were a few withered carrots from the root cellar and 2 leaves of bay that had dried above the hearth, nearly forgotten. She stirred. The pot accepted the offering without judgment. It never needed much. Outside, the wind dragged across the land like a tired cloak. The branches creaked with the weight of snow not yet fallen. Somewhere, a bell tolled, not for a feast, not for mass, but for remembrance. The toll rolled through the valley slowly, as if each chime were wading through grief of its own. The woman sat. Her knees ached, but she did not complain. She held a wooden spoon in her hand like one might hold a candle or a memory, carefully, reverently. The lentils cooked slowly. They always did. They had to soften. So did she. There had been laughter here once. Not loud, but gentle. The child had chased a chicken through the doorway and into the snow. He'd shouted with glee, barefoot and red-cheeked. The pot remembered. It had heard the clatter of his feet, the sound of a scold that wasn't meant to sting, and the giggle that had followed. That was a stew day, a feast day. They'd had barley and a joint of rabbit, and even a piece of hard cheese tucked into the broth to melt down and make it rich. But that was many lentils ago. Tonight was not a feast. Tonight was for the lost. The woman reached for the cloth on her lap. She unfolded it carefully. Inside was a small wooden token, a carved acorn worn smooth from many hands. The child's. She held it close to her chest for a long time. When the soup had begun to thicken, she ladled it into a simple bowl. Clay, chipped at the rim. She placed it on the table and lit a candle beside it. Not for herself. She did not eat yet. She let the steam rise from the bowl. The candle flickered gently in the draught. It cast a halo on the wall behind the pot, and for a moment the woman imagined another presence there. A whisper of her sister's voice, a smile just beyond reach, a child's curious question drifting in like morning mist. She bowed her head. She did not speak, but the silence was full. There is a kind of strength that lives in quiet kitchens. It does not shout. It does not shine. It simmers. The pot knew this kind of strength well. It had seen it in the hands of midwives, in the stooped backs of grandmothers, in the trembling fingers of those who stirred through sorrow. It had felt tears fall into broth, and joy hum softly through the steam. Tonight it was grief, but it was not alone. Outside, in cottages just like this one, across hills and rivers, others stirred lentils too, for other names, other faces, other small tokens held to quiet heart. It was a communion of sorts. Not one written in books or spoken in Latin. Just lentils, and breath, and time. The woman finally took her spoon. She dipped it into the bowl and tasted the soup. It was not rich, not sweet, not sharp, but it was warm, and it was enough. She ate slowly, the way one might read a letter from someone long gone. One word at a time, fearing the end. She closed her eyes between bites. The fire snapped, low and even. The pot, nearly empty now, held the warmth in its belly. It was content. In the morning, the woman would feed the chickens. She would sweep the snow from the path. She would boil more water and crush more garlic. She would write no names down, but she would remember. Tonight, there would be no lullaby, just lentils for the lost, and the breath between bowls, and the pot still warm. Chapter 5. A feast of beans. On the famine's edge, the pot had known lean years. It had known long stretches when a single onion was shared between meals, when even salt was precious. But the year the beans came, the pot remembers that year differently. It was the year the rains came too late. The fields browned in the sun, crops withered, and the well coughed dust. The barley failed first, then the oats. Even the cabbage, always so dependable, curled inward and turned to leather on the stalk. People stopped counting days and started counting meals. But just when the village had begun to quiet, just when the church bells stopped ringing daily, someone knocked on old Toma's door. Toma, once the cooper's apprentice, now a weathered woman of 60 winters, had lived in the same stone cottage since her marriage. Her husband was long gone, and her sons had scattered. One to a distant priory, one to the sea. She had no meat in her house, no grain left in her chest. But when that knock came, she opened the door. There stood a boy, barefoot, cloaked in dust, cheeks hollowed by days without chewing. He held out a sack, no longer than his arm, tied at the top with twine. From the mountain farms, he whispered. They had more. These are for the village. Beans, dight, pale white ones, hard as pebbles. Toma reached out, cradled the sack like a swaddled child, and nodded. Tell them, she said, voice thin but steady. The pot is still warm. The pot was scrubbed that morning. Not with soap, there was none, but with ash and water, rubbed smooth with a cloth made from old linen. Toma set it over the coals and waited. There were no onions, no garlic, no bay leaves or bacon rinds. But she had water. She had time. And now she had beans. She soaked them first in silence. The boy had gone, leaving behind only a footprint and the faint smell of sheep's wool. The beans swelled overnight in the clay bowl, and Toma checked them again at dawn. Smooth, plump, like little moons sleeping in the dark. She added them to the pot with a whisper. Not a feast, but a beginning. By noon, the scent had drifted. Thin though it was, the smell of boiling beans carried. One by one, figures appeared in her doorway. First an old neighbor with hollow cheeks, then 2 children with hands red from nettle stings. No one asked. No one had to. Toma nodded. Bring water. Bring wood. I'll watch the fire. And so the fire grew, low and slow. The pot murmured, a sound between a breath and a hum. The beans softened, and the village remembered itself. That evening, a girl brought a handful of chopped sorrel. From behind the stable, she said, still green. Toma did it in. A boy brought salt, aged. Mother had it hidden in the chimney. It went into the pot, dissolving with a hiss. And then, an old woman who had not left her home in weeks came leaning on a stick, carrying half a turnip. Toma wept when she dropped it in. The pot did not boil. It simmered. And as it simmered, the cottage filled. A man who had lost his wife. A mother with 3 daughters and no bread. A lame farmer whose animals had been taken as tithe. They brought little, but enough. Bits of dried carrot, a bone with just a hint of marrow, a sprig of thyme, old but still fragrant. Thomas stirred it all in. The soup thickened. The sun fell, and one by one they were fed. It was not a meal of laughter. Not yet. But it was a meal of silence broken, of spoons scraping bowls, of breath exhaled, of the softest thank you spoken in the language of chewing. The pot remembered, not for its flavor, though even kings would have wept for a bowl, but for what it held, a turning, a shared breath, a moment where the famine blinked and life blinked back. Toma did not sleep that night. She sat beside the hearth, spoon in hand, stirring clockwise. The pot was not empty. There were always a few ladles left, and the bean broth grew sweeter with each reheating. She ladled some into a cloth-wrapped jar. "For the widow," she murmured. "Her legs won't carry her." Another into a chipped bowl. "For the twins with no mother." Her hands ached, but she did not stop. In her silence, she counted each face she had fed. 19. 19 people with food in their belly. 19 more than the day before. In the days that followed, the soup became a ritual. Each morning, Tama would stir the pot awake. The beans, those stubborn, generous beans, lasted longer than expected. Or maybe, the pot stretched them. No one could say. Each day, something new would arrive. A few strands of barley, dandelion leaves, a cracked egg slipped in during a blessing. And every day, the line at Toma's door grew, not because the soup was rich, because it was shared, because in each bowl there was a little bit of everyone. One morning, as the frost gave way to fog, a monk arrived from the nearby abbey. He stood in silence at the doorway, then pulled from his robe a pouch. "Dried fennel," he said. "For your kindness." Toma smiled. She did not bow. She had become a priestess in her own right, the keeper of the pot, the watcher of the soup, the one who remembered. The fennel went in, the pot sighed, and the village exhaled. They say that winter ended not with spring but with that pot, that the thaw began not in the sky, but in the cottage with the soup. That famine was broken not by harvest, but by hunger shared. The pot remembers. It remembers not the starvation, but the offering, not the silence, but the spoonful, not the lack, but the hand that gave. And that is how the pot made its most humble feast, on beans and courage and the warmth of many hands. Let the fire die low, let the bowl sit warm, and let the memory of that soup linger, quiet but full. Chapter 6. Onion and Grace. The pot had known many flavors, but none quite as humble and enduring as onion. It was a cold, damp morning in late spring. The kind of morning where rain didn't fall but lingered in the air like breath. The kind of day when even the fire was reluctant to wake. In a small hilltop village, near the edge of a forest path, an old widow stirred from her bed of straw and wool. Her name was Ismay, and her hands were slow with age, but still remembered the dance of knife and ladle. She'd been alone for some years now. Her husband had passed the winter a decade ago, taken by a fever. Her children, grown, were scattered far beyond the edges of the village. One was rumored to have gone to the city. Another had joined a convent. She didn't mind the silence. She had her little garden, her hearth, and the pot. It had belonged to her mother before her, and her mother before that. The handles had smoothed under generations of fingers. The bottom was thick with the memory of hundreds of meals, some festive, some meager. It never judged the portions, only held them with patience. That morning, Ismay pulled her shawl close and stepped outside. The rain had left beads on the wild parsley. She picked some quietly. From the little onion bed beneath the window, she pulled 3 yellow bulbs, small, tear-bringing things with roots like frayed lace. She gathered a bit of sage too. dry, silvery, and strong enough to warm the chest. Back inside, she knelt before the hearth and coaxed the fire back to life with a breath and a prayer. The flames yawned awake, licking the bottom of the iron pot like an old dog greeting its master. Ismay added a splash of water from the clay jug. Then came the onions, peeled, halved, then sliced with a slow and practiced hand. She did not hurry. Time had taught her that food made in haste was food that forgot its soul. As the onions sizzled, the scent rose, rich, earthy, familiar. It filled the cottage. Outside, the village dog stirred, noses twitching. A raven on the eaves tilted its head. Somewhere, a child sneezed. Ismay added a pinch of salt, a crumbled piece of dry bread, and the chopped herbs. She stirred slowly, letting each breath of steam warm her face. This was her breakfast, her dinner, perhaps tomorrow's too. It didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth, the act, the grace. Because there is grace in simplicity. Grace in doing the same act, day after day, not because it is expected, but because it keeps you alive. In body, yes, but also in spirit. While the soup simmered, Ismay sat by the hearth with her knitting. Her needles clicked gently like distant raindrops. She did not speak aloud, but the pot heard her. It always did. It remembered the days when Ismay had sung while she cooked, a baby strapped to her back. It remembered laughter, stories, lullabies about foxes and stars. And it remembered the quiet that followed, too. The slow transition from chorus to solo, until the only sound was the knife against the board and the whisper of boiling water. And yet, there was no sorrow in this silence. Ismay's silence was peaceful, full, not empty. It was the silence of someone who had given much, and now lived softly within her own company. Later, a neighbor would knock gently and find a bowl waiting on the doorstep. No words needed. That's how it was between those who understood the cost of loneliness. A bowl of onion soup was not just food, it was an offering of presence. A note that said, "I remember you," even if no one said it aloud. As twilight came, the pot cooled. Ismay wrapped her shawl tighter and blew out the candle. The fire sighed into coals. The night was damp, but her bones were warm, and the pot remembered another soup made, another day held gently, another bowl of grace. Chapter 7. The herb that waited. Nettles in the cloister. The pot was moved again. This time not to a home, not to a cottage, but to a cloistered stone room where silence ran deeper than any well. Wind kissed the chapel walls outside. And within, it was the hour of shadows. The monks had eaten, prayed, and parted, but one remained behind. Not out of forgetfulness, out of devotion. Brother Elric, a man of thin shoulders and slower years, stayed by the fire that evening. His brown robe hung loosely, stained with the modest touch of daily toil. His cowl was down, revealing white, wispy hair and deep lines across his brow that matched the mortar of the abbey stones. In the stillness, he stirred. The pot had become his charge not by duty, but by inheritance. Long ago, another monk, Brother Matthias, had handed it to him with a nod and the words, "She remembers best when stirred clockwise." Elric had nodded back, understanding that the pot held more than broth. It held care, memory, continuity. The monastery garden was bare now, clawed by winter's breath. But in the corner, under frost-lace cloth, a small patch of nettles had survived, green and defiant, sharp to the touch, but gentle in boiling. Elric had gathered them quietly that morning, his fingers wrapped in linen, humming the hymn of St. Cuthbert under his breath. Now they floated, softened in broth. Turnip peelings, crushed garlic, a shred of barley, and the stinging nettle leaves, soaked in slow wisdom. The pot welcomed them like old friends, bubbling without urgency. Elric stirred slowly, the silence deepened by the tick of the fire and the steady sound of the spoon gliding through memories. He did not speak to the pot aloud. He never had. But he believed it listened. He believed it knew when a meal was made not out of want, but of reverence. This soup was for the sick. In the nearby cell, a boy lay, barely old enough to read, let alone chant, tossing in fever and cold. Elric had watched his illness rise like bad weather, and this was the remedy left: warmth and nettle, and the ancient rhythm of the spoon. He added a pinch of crushed sage, dried last summer under the bell tower. The leaves had curled like parchment, but their scent still spoke of sun. Then he waited, and with time he ladled the soup into a simple clay bowl. No tray, no garnish, just steam rising like prayer. The boy stirred in his sleep as Elric arrived. He spooned the broth gently, a touch at a time, letting it slip past dry lips. The boy swallowed and sighed. Outside, the wind softened. Back by the fire, the pot sat empty again. Elric wiped it carefully, then set it on the stones to cool. It was a holy thing now, not because it belonged to the church, but because it had served through so many quiet kindnesses. The cloister echoed with nothing, but the pot remembered, and it waited, as all sacred things do, for the next soft hand and the next winter need. Chapter 8. Bread, Bean, and Blessing. Supper at the edge of day. The day was nearly gone. The last of the light sifted through the kitchen's tiny, uneven window, painting the old stones golden, then gray, then gold again, flickering like the breath of a dying fire. Outside, the world was quieting. Birds nestled into that hush between sun and moon, and far across the fields, the toll of a distant bell marked the fall of daylight. Inside, the pot waited. It had waited through other evenings, hundreds, perhaps thousands. But this one was slow in a different way. Not from neglect. No. The fire beneath it still glowed. But the kitchen around it held a silence not of grief, nor of fasting, but of reverence. The kind of stillness that blankets a room when all the work is done, when no more is needed. A boy was the first to break the hush. His hands, too small for calluses yet, placed a small loaf of dark bread on the wooden table. It was lumpy, scorched in one corner, and carried the unmistakable shape of a first attempt. But the pot knew better than to judge bread by its crust. The mother followed. She moved slowly, not from age but from care. She had always moved like this in the hour before supper, as though time had slowed to match her spoon. She carried a wooden bowl filled with the last of the broad beans. Plump, pale, and slightly speckled, they had soaked all day beside the hearth, nestled under a cloth like swaddled infants. She smiled as she uncovered them, then ran her fingers across their skins as if they were something precious. And then, without hurry, she lifted them into the pot. The old pot received them without complaint. They joined the broth that had been simmering since morning. Onions browned at dawn, garlic bruised at noon, a sprig of marjoram added just as the sun reached its peak. There was no meat in it. There had been none for days. But the beans brought fullness, and the mother's hands brought grace. She stirred once, twice. The spoon carved a slow circle around the pot's inner edge, scraping up stories the way it always did. And though the pot had no voice, if it could have spoken, it would have said, "Yes, this is a meal worth remembering." The family gathered. There were 5 of them tonight. The mother and her 2 sons, the elder daughter just returned from gathering nettles, and the grandfather, his legs wrapped in wool, his beard flecked with ash. They took their places not around a grand table, but around the hearth, knees tucked, shoulders close, bowls waiting patiently. Before the ladle touched the soup, the grandfather raised his hand. He did this each evening, in the hour just before the first spoonful. A silent pause, a breath, not a formal prayer, though it had once been. Over the years it had become something simpler, a moment to remember the fields, the weather, the aching backs that gathered roots from frozen soil, the good neighbor who traded salt for wood, the cow that still gave milk, the daughter who came home with wild greens in her pocket. And when the silence had held just long enough, he murmured, "Bless this pot. It never asks for thanks, and it never holds a grudge." The family smiled. The pot, if it could smile, would have done the same. Then came the serving. The eldest daughter ladled the soup. Her hands had grown steady since spring. Her wrists no longer trembled when the pot was full. She poured carefully. 1 bowl, 2, 3, leaving enough room for torn bread dye. The boy reached for the loaf and broke it with a proud, clumsy twist. Crumbs scattered like tiny stars across the stone floor. The meal began, not with ceremony but with gratitude. The boy slurped first, unable to wait. His mother followed with a smaller, slower bite. The daughter soaked bread in broth and chewed with her eyes closed. The grandfather said nothing, but the sigh he gave after his second spoonful carried more reverence than words ever could. In that moment, the kitchen became something holy. There was no gold on the wall, no sacred books or relics, but the warmth that spread through the air from pot to bowl to chest felt like a blessing all the same. The kind that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. A quiet supper, beans soft as butter, bread torn by hands that still knew how to share. They ate until bowls were empty. Then came the last piece of bread, just one left. The boy reached for it, paused, and looked to his sister. She raised her brow. He looked to his mother. He nodded once, and he tore it in half. He dipped one piece into the faint traces of broth, still clinging to the pot's inner wall, then handed the other piece to his grandfather. The old man took it with fingers like bark. His eyes didn't water. He was past that. But the pot remembered his silence in a way that felt louder than speech. When the last crumb had been eaten, the family sat in the cooling quiet. The fire had dimmed, though it still breathed. The pot now rested empty, its belly warm and slick with memory. The mother wiped its rim with a cloth, the way she always did, not to polish it, but to thank it. She set it back on the stone ledge above the coals, ready, patient, waiting again. Then something rare happened. The daughter rose and took a small bundle from her satchel. She unfolded it slowly, revealing 3 wrinkled apples. Bruised, yes, but whole. She handed one to her brother, one to her mother, and kept one for herself. No one asked where she had found them. He didn't say, but the pot understood. It was the way of that kitchen. What came in was shared. What fed one, fed all. What was given, grew. They ate the apples with quiet laughter, and afterward the boy leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, sighing deeply. Outside, the first stars blinked through the soot-colored sky. Inside, the pot sat in the darkening room, still warm, still listening. It had been witness to stews made from near nothing, soups flavored by sacrifice, and broths stirred with prayer. It had held hunger and healing, joy and grief, birth and burial. And tonight, it held one more story. Bread shared without asking, beans lifted in gratitude, and a quiet supper lit by the last light of day. It would remember, because pots do not forget, not truly, not when they've held this much life. The pot that remembered, the embers have softened, and the pot rests once more. It remembers the sounds of spoons, of children's laughter, of silence between 2 breaths, and keeps them all, like stories sealed in clay. Thank you for joining me beside the hearth tonight. If this story brought you peace, know there are more waiting. Quiet corners of time, flickering gently in the dark. You're welcome back any time. Just follow the light of this sleepless lantern. Good night.